If you are somebody that knows about the binge restrict cycle, you know that this can feel like you are completely out of control. Like there is no hope for learning to acknowledge those hunger and fullness cues. And that if you allow yourself access to certain foods, you'll never stop eating. As a former binge eater, I can definitely share some sympathy in these experiences. I recall I used to sit down with an entire pan of lasagna, garlic bread, and any other goodie I could fit onto the table. And I would just eat it until either I was so sick I couldn't move or that pan was finished. And typically, I finished the entire spread on the table. I recall it actually caused relationship problems for me with my binge restrict cycle because I used to get so irately angry at my partner who didn't finish his prescribed portion that I had set aside for him in my mind, which meant that I had to continue eating to satisfy the urges of my binge. Now, for somebody that experiences the binge restrict cycle, it can feel completely unraveling to think about getting rid of that restrictive piece of the binge restrict cycle. Because after all, you feel like once the foods that you desire are put in front of you, you're never going to stop. You'll just eat anything that is in the kitchen that you find desirable. So you feel like you must impose these limits of restriction in order to not tyrannically parade through the kitchen and eat everything possible in sight. But the unfortunate reality is the piece of this cycle that is actually keeping you binging and feeling so out of control with food is actually not the binging, it's the restricting. And that's a hard pill to swallow because that is the one thing that, as a former binge eater, I felt like I could control in this vicious beast of a cycle. So, the best things that you can do if you are somebody that binge and restricts is to focus on eliminating that restriction piece versus eliminating the binge piece. And here's why. The longer we try to get rid of the binge, the deeper it is going to go. So if we just try to will it away and say, that's not something that I'm going to do again, that's not something I should be thinking about, it's actually going to amplify that binging in our brain, which is the exact opposite of what we want. So it's kind of like what I call the white bear phenomenon. If I were to tell you, don't think about white bears, what are you thinking about right now? Probably something similar to a white bear. And that's because our brain is automatically attracted to those things which we set as off limits. So if we think, I'm not going to binge ever again, well, we're actually doing ourselves the opposite of a favor. Instead, let's work on normalizing our meals and snacks and trying to reduce the restrictive piece as much as we possibly can versus trying to eradicate those binges. I know that feels like the last thing that you want to do. And if you would have told me during my extreme episodes of binge eating that I would be able to one day have a peaceful relationship with food, I would have said that you are totally full of shit. I am a person that doesn't have fullness cues, and therefore I cannot be trusted with food. However, cannot be further from the truth, and you too can normalize your relationship with food. The first thing that we're going to have to do to break the binge restrict cycle is we're going to have to eat a regular breakfast, lunch, dinner, and ideally 3 snacks. These meals and snacks should be balanced, so they should contain an array of nutrients such as carbohydrates, fats, proteins, fruits and vegetables, and anything else that we're desiring. The biggest thing to remember here is that our body has become used to binge eating. So it's very unlikely that just because we impose a regular meal and snack schedule, we're going to immediately eradicate those binges. But it's a start. So starting with normalizing the meals and snacks is really going to help to reduce the binge eating. The next thing that we're going to want to work through is our thought process as we work through a binge. So we want to try to steer clear of trying to stop that binge. We instead want to give ourselves empathy and compassion if we have binged. Here's the hard truth. In order to beat the binge restrict cycle, we have to allow ourselves to binge. And that is the hardest truth for a person that is experiencing binge restrict cycle or a full-blown binge eating disorder. That feels like the absolute last thing that we want to do. But I promise you, if you do not eradicate the restriction and work through coping with the binges with grace and relieving some of that food guilt following, then you will not break the binge restrict cycle. So, step 1, normalize the meals and snacks. Step 2, give yourselves grace during the binges. And step 3, give yourself some coping tools to try to either reduce or push off binges. So these could be things like pushing off a binge for 5 minutes. So we're not saying you cannot binge, but what we're saying is, can we just push it off 5 to 10 minutes and increase that duration from one binge to the next? Other things you might try are things like planning out a binge. So if you know that in the evenings you frequently binge, maybe planning it out for 6 o'clock is the time that I'm actually just going to sit down and binge on anything that I want. And what that does is it actually gets rid of the mental restriction in our brain around a binge. And mental restriction around food can be just as damaging as physical restriction around food. The mental restriction, even if we're not physically restricting food because we've already put into place those normal meals and snacks, is still going to lead to binging. So if you are binging still, then you are either physically restricting your food somewhere or mentally restricting your food somewhere. And in order to break the binge restrict cycle, we actually have to get rid of both of those things.